When beginning the study of Hinduism, I mentioned that we had to keep in mind so many limitations when using a term like Hinduism or a term like Hindu. And part of the reason was because what we call Hinduism really represents a plurality of traditions. And while there certainly is a sense of overlap among all the communities that we would recognize as Hindu, there is so much diversity and complexity that it is really hard to do anything else besides generalization when thinking about the Hindu tradition. Now, certainly when we study other religious traditions, we will see complexity and diversity and plurality. And yet I think in some of the other traditions that we will look at, we will see a little bit more universality than what we might have been able to find within Hinduism. So as we turn to Buddhism, one thing that is of course helpful is that the term Buddhism clearly derives from the term Buddha, which has to do with the historical figure, our Buddha, who lived roughly 2,500 years ago and started the religion that as scholars we will refer to as Buddhism, as he taught the world the path to enlightenment that he had discovered. Now, as we start discussing Buddhism, I want to begin with one very central concept. And again, perhaps in some ways unlike Hinduism, I believe that this concept will be seen as fundamental to almost any Buddhist you will ever encounter. And it is the concept of the triple refuge. Now, sometimes there are other names given to this concept. Sometimes it is referred to as the triple gem or the three jewels. Obviously, when you think of gems and jewels, you think of things with value. So clearly those names suggest the importance, the value of this concept. But I always prefer referring to this concept as the triple refuge because I think that tells us a little bit more about how most Buddhists will view the three elements of this triple refuge. That is, these are the things in which we as Buddhists find refuge. This is where we find guidance. This is where we find the structure of our faith, right? So this is a very central concept, and I think it would be difficult to find a Buddhist who would not acknowledge the absolute centrality of this concept of the triple refuge. So below here, I have typed out the three aspects of the triple refuge. First is the Buddha. And again, generally when Buddhists will recite the triple refuge, when you will say, to the Buddha for refuge I go, to the Dharma for refuge I go, to the Sangha for refuge I go, and you recite that several times. When you refer to the Buddha in the triple refuge, you again are referring generally to our historical Buddha, that individual that lived, again, somewhere around 2,500 years ago in northern India and taught what we will consider the Buddhist tradition. So to take refuge in him in some ways means you're taking refuge in him as the example. He achieved enlightenment. His path is the one for us to follow. So we take refuge in the fact that he traveled that path, reached nirvana, and therefore we are able to try to follow in those footsteps and reach nirvana or enlightenment on our own. The second aspect of the triple refuge is the Dharma. Now, you saw Dharma being used in our introduction to Hinduism. Their Dharma primarily had to do with relationship-specific moral obligations. Now, there's certainly a similarity in the way Dharma might be understood within Buddhism, but oftentimes Dharma within Buddhism is going to be a bit of a broader concept, right? So I want to think of Dharma as the eternally true teachings of our Buddha. It's important to recognize that these are not just the teachings of our Buddha, but they are the eternally true teachings of our Buddha. As we will see in future videos, the idea is that what our Buddha taught us was nothing brand new. It is what previous Buddhas have taught us, and it's what future Buddhas will teach us. It is simply the fact that our Buddha, in our historical age, taught us these eternal truths. So these are the eternally true teachings of the Buddha. And what that means is that certainly these teachings will encompass some of those moral teachings, moral obligations that we thought of when thinking about Hindu Dharma. But obviously here, the teachings are going to go beyond simply moral teachings to other teachings about the reality of the universe, the way to understand ourselves, the way to understand the spiritual path. So it will encompass more than just strict moral teachings, but it will include moral teachings. So again, think of the Dharma as the eternally true teachings of our Buddha, and to say that you take refuge in the Dharma is to say that you don't just take refuge in the Buddha and the example that he left behind. You also take refuge in the teachings that he left behind. Those teachings that have been remembered and handed down from generation to generation, so that we, even today, can learn about the path to enlightenment that the Buddha himself traveled and taught about to his followers. And then third, you take refuge in the Sangha. Now the Sangha, as we will see later on, sometimes has a couple of different meanings. Sometimes Sangha can refer specifically to the monastic community within Buddhism, that is, the monks and the nuns within Buddhism. Other times, Sangha refers to all Buddhists, both monastic and lay alike. Lay is usually the word that we use to refer to regular members of a religion. Maybe not the specialists, maybe not those who devote everything to the religious path, but the more regular, average members of a religion. We'll use this in all religious traditions that we study. So again, Sangha might have that broader meaning of both the monks and nuns and lay Buddhists, or it may have that more precise meaning of just the monks and the nuns, the monastic community. I think generally when reciting the Triple Refuge, Buddhists might be thinking of that more specific meaning to Sangha. That is, I take refuge in the generations of monks and nuns who have devoted their entire lives to the Dharma, to the teachings of our Buddha. They are the ones responsible for preserving those teachings and spreading them to others. So I, in this case, as a lay Buddhist, would take refuge in the Sangha, in the monastic community, for preserving the Dharma that was taught by our Buddha. So you can see how all three aspects of the Triple Refuge work together. And as we continue our introduction to Buddhism, we'll kind of actually use the framework of the Triple Refuge to introduce the religion. We will start by talking about the Buddha. That is the general concept of a Buddha, and then more specifically, we will talk about our Buddha. And then we will talk about the Dharma, especially the Dharma left behind by our Buddha. And then we will talk about the Sangha, the community, and how it continued to develop through the ages as it tried to understand the Dharma and make sense of the example left behind by our Buddha. Now, again, despite the general universality of the Triple Refuge, it is still important to recognize that there will be a great deal of diversity and complexity within Buddhism. So we will say more about the three vehicles when we reach their moment of origin in history, but I just want to at least alert you to the fact that we will have three broad groups within Buddhism, three broad branches within the Buddhist tradition. These are listed here for you as the three vehicles, which is usually the way we think about these three broad branches. They are the vehicles of following the Buddhist path, of understanding the Dharma and seeking enlightenment. So first there is the Theravada branch of Buddhism. This, as scholars would believe, is the oldest of the surviving forms of Buddhism. And we'll say more about how it perhaps emerges and survives several hundred years after our Buddha lived, reached enlightenment, and died. Second, there will be the Mahayana form of Buddhism. Mahayana, if you've studied Hinduism in the previous series, you saw that Maha generally means great. So here, Mahayana, the greater vehicle, right? So the Mahayana Buddhists, as they emerged, in some ways were comparing their understanding of the Dharma to what the Theravada Buddhists believed. And they were saying that we represent a greater vehicle than what is represented by Theravada Buddhism. For that reason, Mahayana Buddhists actually started referring to Theravada Buddhists as Hinayana Buddhists. If Mahayana means the greater vehicle, Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. So there's clearly a kind of comparative, even pejorative interpretation there when using the term Hinayana. So as scholars, we generally avoid that. when speaking of Theravada Buddhism, but you might run across it when reading things that are coming from the Mahayana perspective and discussing Theravada Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhists may still use the term Hinayana to think of Theravada Buddhism. Okay? And then finally, we have Vajrayana. We'll talk about the different meanings of that term. And this will be the third major branch within Buddhism. And it will in some ways flow out of the Mahayana tradition, taking many of the Mahayana beliefs and practices, but then perhaps adding new, unique ideas and rituals to the Buddhist path. Interestingly, each of these three vehicles is going to become dominant in a particular portion of Asia, first and foremost. Eventually, today, all three vehicles exist throughout the world. But Theravada Buddhism is going to become the dominant expression of Buddhism, generally in Southeast Asia. Right? Mahayana is going to become dominant in East Asia. It'll be the dominant form of Buddhism in places like China and Korea and Japan. And then Vajrayana early on becomes dominant in areas north of India, in places like Mongolia and most notably Tibet. Much of Buddhism largely vanishes from its homeland of India, and we'll see the reasons why later on. But thankfully for Buddhism, prior to that, missionary monks and perhaps nuns had already taken these three branches outside of India and established strongholds in other portions of Asia, so that as Buddhism largely disappeared from India, it was able to survive elsewhere. So again, we'll see how those vehicles emerge throughout history as we continue our historical development, but at least we have a good sense of the framework that we will use based on the Triple Refuge as we continue to study the Buddhist tradition.